is largely a Court of Owls story. I was curious how much involvement Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo had in that process.
So, I mean, we were really, really fortunate in the sense that when we went to DC and we went to Warner and we pitched them on the concept that we had in mind, not just the fact that it involves the Court of Owls, but the fact that we were killing Batman. Once they signed off on that idea, you know, almost immediately were like, listen, we have an opportunity for you to go in and spend some time presenting this to Jim Lee so that we're getting kind of direct feedback on the kind of overarching creative vision, but also having Scott come in. So I got to spend about a day with him. I gave him sort of the initial pitch in advance, walked him through what it is we had in mind, gave him kind of the overarching backbone of the storyline we were thinking of, and it was fantastic in the sense that if you've ever watched Scott's YouTube channel, you'll know he has no problem spending 90 minutes diving deep into aspects of storytelling or aspects of a particular world. So, you know, having him as someone that I could bounce ideas off of, even for just a single session, was actually tremendously powerful. He helped us frame and really understand the implications of killing Batman, probably better than anybody else I've spoken to outside of the team. And in terms of diving into the Court of Owls, you know, I think for him, because he's introduced this concept into the lore relatively recently in the grand scheme of things, there haven't been that many adaptations of the Court of Owls except for what we saw in Gotham, what we've seen in some of the animated work. I think for him, he felt like there was a lot of room there to play with this as an idea. And yes, we're bringing certain iconic elements from the story to life in the game. You will absolutely recognize those elements when you see them. But at the same time, you know, he understood as someone who plays games that we would need to adapt certain ideas. How do Talons work? Are there more than one kind of Talon? You know, when he and Greg were working on the storyline, that could be handled in a more mysterious, shadowy kind of way, where there's a kind of range to how that unfolds over the course of the history of the Talon. You know, for us, we need to solidify it into clear, distinct buckets so that we can build it, and so we can make it work, and we can balance it against the capabilities of our player. So I think making sure that we had a dialogue with Scott about that early on was super important. It gave us a sense of visibility ahead of the play.
I think the Arkham games have really redefined Batman because not only in games but like see it in the shows and the movies and cartoons. Are there any ways that you think this game is going to do a similar thing? Anything specific that you think is so good that it might end up in a movie or a show?
Well, I mean, there's a couple things that I think that we were able to do that I'm really proud of. One of which is we took this kind of immediate circle of Bat family characters who have certainly started to have their day, right? Like certainly if you watch Talons or you watch any of the recent adaptations, you're seeing these characters in various forms, but they've tended to be part of very, very large ensembles. So what I think we've been able to do is say we really want to tell a family story. We really want to see what it looks like when this particular group of crime fighters who are kind of young and that are going through their own kind of generational rebellion are kind of flung together under these tragic circumstances and then forced to adapt to this changing status quo. So I think we have absolutely succeeded at that. There are a number of, like, I would say small discrete elements in our game that I look at and go, damn, we really nailed that. And I hope someday that inspires somebody to say, I love our Bat cycle, for example. It's got such a distinct design to it, it operates. I want to see someone do something with that idea of the Bat cycle. But I mean, that's one thing, that's essentially it. I think some of the ways that we have interpreted some of the villains in our game, not all of whom are being revealed, not all of whom we talk about, I'm especially proud of. So I would love to do the follow-up to that question in a few weeks when we have a big villain reveal. What's that? Well, Freeze was, we revealed Freeze at the very beginning, and I think we are doing some things with Freeze that I think are really cool and exciting. But yeah, I want to hear how people react when we talk about the new things.
There's a vacuum in Gotham for that where are they ordering times of a work that they could and that's when I'll take the
Yeah, that's a great question. So our Gotham City is because you're out there on the streets fighting crime night after night, you have contact with, you have interaction with everyday Gotham Knights. Now, admittedly, it's 3 in the morning in Gotham City. Not a lot of people are necessarily going to go like grocery shopping at that point. They're not doing yoga in the park. But they're there, and they're, and as a result, the crime that you're fighting brushes up against them. The way the GCPD is trying to deal with keeping order brushes up against them. When you encounter Gotham Knights, especially at the start of the game, they're not super keen on being, they're scared because of Batman's absence. They're scared to see where Batman's headed, but they're not sure that more vigilantes is the solution. Over the course of the game, as you work your way through the progression, you start to turn the page a little. They start to realize that maybe you're taking a better approach than what the police are doing. And so we kind of think of the player as being in the middle of a Gotham ecosystem that's where there's tension between the citizens, the police, and obviously the criminals. And that by managing that from within, maybe you're showing them a better way.
You mentioned that the adapting swords game and Talons.
Excellent, welcome.
Expand on it. You guys sell more and give other examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think in theory, if we were making a Gotham City with the actual range of criminal activities that you might imagine would be present, I think we could build an incredibly complex simulation that the player would never really be able to manage. You could have dozens or hundreds of individual criminal gangs and enterprises and crime that is, emergent, and the reality is the player wouldn't be able to parse it, and they wouldn't understand how to prepare for it, and they wouldn't understand what the relationship was between who they were up against and the gear and the abilities that they were unlocking and upgrading. So we needed to be able to take our criminal ecosystem and define it in terms of three main factions. The regulator faction with their tech focus, the mob with their classic criminal focus, the freaks with their kind of focus on chaos. And that allowed us to build the kind of iconic spectrum of what Gotham crime is about. And then the individual crimes that bubble out of that I kind of think of them as individual, almost like little mini game modes that we're able to instance and spawn in different parts of the city. That is a conceit that you need to do in order for a video game to be buildable and also comprehensive to the player. Very different from saying, we're going to build Sim Gotham Crime, which would be a very, very different kind of game.
So Batman has a really vast you said that we're going to get some sort of reveal about who's the next big bad. How do you really narrow it down who gets to go in the game and who gets to go?
So our approach in going into villains was to say, if we're already looking at how Batman's death affects the heroes that are closest to him and the city, it should also be, let's look at the villains whose relationship with Batman would cause them to be forced to redefine themselves by his absence, if that makes sense. I said that poorly, but I'll say it again. So what I mean is, it's always been the case that Batman has a special relationship with his adversaries. And if you take Batman out of the picture, it does create a vacuum. It creates a kind of internal vacuum. How are they motivated? Who are they comparing themselves to? Who are they opposing themselves against? And so we wanted to look at kind of a few different archetypes of Batman villains that are definitely, part of the kind of core group of recognizable blue chip villains, and then throw them into disarray and show how they evolve as a result.
All right, so outside of a love for those Gotham games and anything you enjoyed, I was really tight on it. What are you guys kind of doing to really bring in those new players, to bring in that new audience that hasn't played those new games? What are you guys doing different that those games haven't already done?
I mean, I think there's a few things. Super good question. I mean, I think, one thing is the Arkham games are classics, and I think we'll continue to attract new players, who are, curious to know more about those storylines and the interpretations of those characters. I think when we set out to build Gotham Knights, we said we are building a long engagement experience where players will feel like they have a big runway for growing their hero. Once they kind of figure out which of their heroes they like, who matches their style of play, that they will have a lot of goals that they can set for themselves and they can think about and build strategies towards. And I think that, for the current generation of players, that sense of I can project myself playing this game for many, many hours and I can imagine myself cultivating like my version of a Robin or a Red Hood or a Batgirl or a Nightwing, it really drives me, motivates me. And I think a lot of younger players now have that expectation that the game will deliver that. You know, yeah, cool, you gave me an open world, awesome, I'm looking forward to exploring that, but I need to have a reason to do it. Okay, well what if we're telling you that by going out and fighting crime in the open world, you are building your capacity to grow your neuro into something that feels unique to you as a player. And I think that's an important idea that we started with, and we really built the whole game around.
So no Batman.
Who is your favorite DC characters?
Who's my favorite DC?
Yes.
Oh man, that's a tough one. So, I mean, I'm a massive Batman fan, but I will say, like, I of late have really come to appreciate the Batman, not just the Batman villains, but the villains generally within the DC universe. I think that, I mean, I love Marvel comics, I love all comics, but I will say that there's something about the rogues gallery of the larger DC universe that I find super compelling. You know, there are characters who are tragic, there's characters who are smart, and even though you don't necessarily want to be them, you can at least empathize with them in a lot of cases, right? So, and I find that the range is really interesting. So I tend to gravitate towards stories around characters like Deathstroke, or characters like, you know, even characters like the Joker, obviously, right? You know, it's characters that have this kind of deep well of pathology that ultimately drives them, and then gives our heroes something to stand in opposition to.
Thank you.
Were you surprised at the passion in the fan base about Nightwing's cakes?
No, I'm not surprised at that.
Any reconsidering on changing the size of them?
Nope. We gotta leave some room.
Let's do it.
So, the aspect of the without getting into villains and all that, usually at the end of the game there was people had a playability to go back and do puzzles. Is that something you're bringing in with 4 different heroes? You know, that there can be puzzles that you're going to have to do with different heroes.
Right. So all of the content in the game is playable with any of the heroes.
Okay.
Now it's true that there are, you know, just organically in terms of how the game works and it works sort of systemically, there will be builds of certain heroes that might give you a leg up in certain situations, but it's part of a continuum. You know, there's very little in the game that I would say is like deterministically, oh, you need to have like the blue card in order to open the whole thing. It's not this at all. It's like there's always degrees, there's degrees of efficiency. What I will say is we haven't announced it yet, not ready to talk about it yet, but there are that kind of replay driver that you're describing, we'll be talking about soon.
Okay.
That is all the time we have.
Thank you.
Was that it?